Hello InfoPerson, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss some of the more recent discoveries, and I guess some of the more unusual discoveries, when it comes to the evolution of the brain, and specifically the evolution of the nervous system, and the eventual development of intelligence. And that's because in some of the recent years, scientists have actually used a lot of comparative studies using animals like, for example, octopuses, in order to compare how brains seem to have developed in them, and eventually discovering certain surprises that we're going to be discussing in this video. And so some of these recent studies, even examining animals that are at least 800 million years old, could now help us understand just a little bit more about how our complex brains seem to have evolved, allowing us to maybe start making conclusions about whether this is going to happen somewhere else out there in the rest of the galaxy, or if this is just some kind of a quirk that might never repeat again anywhere. And so let's talk about some of these surprising discoveries that challenge our understanding of how intelligence seems to have formed, and challenge the assumption we always had about how the evolution of brain must have happened, because before it was always believed to be a kind of a straight line, essentially leading from simple worms to much more complex animals like primates. But the reality might not be exactly the same. But to start, let's go back approximately 800 million years and take a look at these strange guys. These are known as placozoans, extremely small flattened animals, approximately 1 millimeter across, that though resemble and act like amoeba, are actually animals because they do contain multiple cells. But they lack any tissues or organs, so this is basically as simple as it gets when it comes to animal life. As a matter of fact, they don't even have any body symmetry. And here's roughly what their typical life is like. They move around and they then absorb different food particles. And so to understand where we are in terms of intelligence and in terms of brain development, we might want to start right here. Because even though originally scientists thought that first brain cells may have appeared in some of the more recognizable animals, that's not exactly what this particular study discovers. Turns out these tiny blob-like creatures, just a little bit bigger than a typical grain of sand, seem to contain something referred to as peptidergic cells. And these types of cells seem to use chemical signaling, in this case using peptides, to essentially coordinate movement and to allow this animal to move around and to consume those particles. And in terms of functionality, this is very similar to our own neurons. They even contain some of the same genes as human neurons, which then allow them to function in a very similar way. And so scientists now consider these to be a kind of an evolutionary stepping stone. So essentially this is maybe how neurons initially began. But these are definitely not neurons because they lack specialized synapses, or basically gaps between neurons. They are very often used for electrochemical communication. But this does suggest that the blueprint for our brain was already being developed in very tiny amorphous blobs approximately 800 million years ago, way before an actual brain appeared. But this also brings us to the next important question. So in terms of brains and in terms of, I guess, intelligence, did the nervous system evolve only once, or has it tried to evolve multiple times, but possibly only succeeded once? And well, this question brings us to our next study. The study that you can find in a description that focuses on animals referred to as ctenophores, also known as jellies. Here's roughly what most of them look like. And so in this recent study, scientists discovered that a lot of jellies seem to contain a kind of a fused nerve net, which is something we've never actually seen in other animals. And that's because in pretty much all other animals that contain a nervous system, neurons are always separate cells and communicate with each other using synapses. But in these jellies, the membranes are actually connected in a kind of a continuous path referred to as syncytium. Something that kind of looks like this. And this is like nothing we've seen in any animals anywhere. This is basically an entirely different nervous system that's fundamentally different from every other animal. And so many scientists now believe that ctenophores might have evolved their nervous system in entirely different ways from the rest of us, implying that the nervous system definitely evolved at least twice, although quite possibly a lot more than that. But based on this discovery, we can also assume that this particular nervous system, or this type of a structure, is not as efficient as what we have, because managing this system seems to be a lot more challenging. Mostly because here you just have one huge system, as opposed to individual neurons, which are much easier to manage. Okay, now let's talk about big brains, or essentially animals that manage to develop relatively large nervous systems, and even developed what we would call intelligence. And here we obviously can look at a lot of different examples, But one of the best comparisons we can make is to basically compare what we have, or what primates have, with something else that was developed entirely independently in the ocean. And well, here we're talking about different types of invertebrates, such as, for example, octopuses. In this case, when it comes to ocean animals, octopuses are usually considered to be some of the smartest. Okay, technically you could argue that whales and dolphins are pretty smart, but they're mammals and are much closer to us than octopuses, so it kind of doesn't count. And so here in this recent study, scientists were trying to answer a very different question. The question being, why exactly did big brains evolve to begin with? Because the previous assumption was that it was maybe because animals became social, and to manage complex social lives, we basically required bigger brains. This is normally referred to as social brain hypothesis. And so to manage complex social lives, a lot of groups required more processing power, and thus over time developed much larger brains. And this hypothesis seems to apply pretty well for primates and even for animals like dolphins. But it's still a hypothesis. And so in this particular study, researchers decided to see if there is an asocial brain hypothesis. And here they focused on cephalopods. So once again, invertebrates like octopuses and squid. And this was actually a very large study. It involved 79 different species of cephalopods, including octopuses, squid, and cuttlefish. With the overall conclusion being that this particular hypothesis, or the social brain hypothesis, definitely doesn't apply to them. And specifically because a lot of octopuses are usually solitary and short-lived. Sometimes they're even cannibalistic. So basically they don't really like others, and they don't really manage social groups very well. I mean, it does actually happen in some cases, which we'll be discussing in a separate video. There's a really intriguing discovery of a kind of an octopus village in Australia, but that's super rare. Instead, for the most part, scientists discovered that most of these species don't like friends. And instead they found that their brain size is actually linked to ecological complexity. And for the most part, animals that lived in the deep ocean did not possess large brains, whereas animals that survived mostly on the coast and especially in the shallows, or the so-called calorie-rich seafloor, almost always had larger brains required for the survival in this habitat. And so here this asocial brain hypothesis suggests that if you live in a complex environment where you actually have to solve puzzles to find a lot of high-energy food, your brain will grow in order to handle this information, regardless if you have friends or not. And so for octopuses, whose brain-to-body ratio is comparable to a lot of different vertebrates that exhibit high intelligence, this is the only explanation that made sense. And so in the absence of social learning, large brains can still evolve if the energy required to grow them is offset by the rewards of a complex, calorie-rich environment. But in this case, the important part is, of course, the habitat complexity. So specifically, the seafloor in this case was a lot more complex and involved a lot of unusual 3D environments, which obviously required sophisticated navigation skills, but also environments that required a lot of camouflage and many different tricky hunting strategies. And so because of these very complex hunting strategies, they had to acquire very complex brains. This also supports the idea known as the extractive foraging, or finding and extracting difficult prey. And so unlike in mammals, here social complexity showed absolutely no significant correlation with brain size. And so even though certain squid do actually live in large communities, in most cases they seem to possess small brains. And so since cephalopods and vertebrates diverged approximately 500 million years ago, this study provides us with a powerful example of this convergent evolution, and does suggest that intelligence in general is not some kind of a one-way street, but only one possible solution. Instead, ecological challenges can create cognitive niches that then drive the evolution of a massive complex nervous system, even if the animal lives completely by itself. And so in this case, this is also referred to as an ecological intelligence. Intelligence that depends on complex environments where high-quality food is available for those animals smart enough to extract it. Okay, cool. But what about us? What about our brains, compared to, for example, let's say, other primates? Well, here we do have several studies, but most of them focus on very specific genes that seem to have appeared in humans, but not in other primates. And so the answer in this case seems to lie in what's known as human accelerated regions. Basically parts of DNA that remain unchanged for millions of years, but for some reason suddenly spliced up and became different in humans. And so in this particular study by Katie Pollard, one of the discoveries was that it wasn't even about a typical DNA sequence or a specific gene, but it was actually about how everything folds in 3 dimensions inside the cell. And so here this was about what's known as structural changes. And so because our DNA can fold differently, it sometimes can hijack certain enhancers that can then start affecting different genes. For example, imagine an enhancer that used to control blood hormones, but because of this new fold, it now sits right next to the brain gene and starts regulating neurotransmitters. And so here at least one of the differences was really because of the way our genes seem to be folded. But other studies discovered something else as well. They actually discovered entirely new genes that seem to be human only. For example, in at least one study, researchers discovered certain genes that evolved from something that was previously non-coding, or basically something that used to be junk DNA. But at least one of them evolved completely by accident, with this specific gene slowing down the maturation of neural stem cells, which then allows them to divide much more often and results in a much larger neocortex. Or essentially it slows down neuronal growth, which surprisingly then produces much larger brains. In other words, a lot of differences between humans and other primates really seems to be in these very unusual accidental genetic mutations. But not all differences, because some differences seem to be because of microbes, with at least one study from December of 2024 confirming something that we kind of suspected already. Our gut microbiome, or basically the collection of microbes living inside of us, and there's like trillions and trillions of them by the way, might have been one of the main foundations for why our brain was able to evolve. And that's because in a lot of experiments, scientists discovered that microbes inside our guts were much better at producing glucose, which is of course one of the primary fuel for brains. And so here so many microbes were channeling energy toward the brain, basically feeding it and allowing it to become larger. But even more surprisingly, these microbes begin shaping the brain while a fetus is still inside the womb. Or basically the maternal microbes seem to actually directly influence the development of the brain as soon as it starts growing inside the womb. But the thing is, when it comes to human intelligence and the human brain, there are still so many unanswered questions. We only started scratching the surface in the last few years, and that means that there is so much more to discover, and we don't really have all of the answers yet. But I guess what's the main conclusion? Well, obviously there's still so much to learn, but the main idea here is that intelligence and complex brains don't always follow the same footsteps. And in some animals, like for example in starlit sea anemone, intelligence and even memory can still be displayed even without the brains. These animals somehow can actually remember links between light and electric shocks. On top of this also confirms that complex intelligence does not always arise as a result of social life. So basically being social does not make you intelligent, because here ecological niches can also produce this if there are specific benefits. But at the same time, in order to have intelligence, we also require a little bit of help, specifically from our microbes. And so the microbial balance in certain organisms may suddenly encourage the growth of a complex brain and thus allow animals to become smarter. You can learn more about some of these really interesting examples in some of the previous videos in the description. But in terms of the biological conclusions, well, here we can definitively state that the evolution of the brain is not just a story about getting smarter. It's a story of energy environment, DNA folding, and even bacterial symbiosis. And it's a story that seems to have happened several times, and in some cases was just a little bit more successful than others. Which I guess also implies that if something like this exists elsewhere, there is now a slight chance that maybe intelligence or complex brains could evolve somewhere else. And that's of course the big question. Is intelligence just a fluke on planet Earth, or did it happen elsewhere? Now, we're not going to have the answer to that for a very long time, but that's what we're going to try to answer in the next few decades. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.